black guy that's been he's been in jail now for about 40 days, and we I visited with him twice a week, and I saw him yesterday, and he said, "Brother Mark," and I said, "Yeah." He says, "I know you from somewhere else." I said, "Where do you know me?" I said, "You look familiar to me too, but I couldn't figure it out. I figured you'd just been in here before." He said, "Well, I had been in here before, but that's not where I know you from." I said, "Well, tell me about it." And he said, "I came to your church, me and my wife, one time. One time." I said, "Really?" I said, what made you all of a sudden remember that?" He said, "One of the guys said that you were at South Walker Baptist Church," and he said we lived down the road from there. Me and my wife did at the time. And when she became pregnant, we came to your church and asked for you to pray for our baby. And it all came back, hit me in the face. I remembered him just like that after that. They had come in 2019. Actually, it may have been early in 2020. Neither one of us could remember exactly. But he remembered Shelby singing on stage because I said something about that during the service, and something else that he remembered that I didn't remember. But I remembered them coming up after the service in the invitation time and asking if I would pray for their unborn child. And so we all did. We gathered, the whole church gathered around them when that happened, and we prayed for them. And it was I was so glad he remembered it, and I'm so glad he put all that together. But he is to be out tomorrow. I think they're going to let him out. They're supposed to be here Sunday. I hope it all works out. They don't live here anymore. They live up on Burgess Road. Uh, yeah, it was pretty cool. And I try to not ever know why those guys are there, but I had to ask him then. And he said, "I got in an argument with my wife, and she got scared and called the deputies, and here I am." So I asked him if he had a place to go back home to, because a lot of times they can't go back, but evidently all that's been worked out. So couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. World does get small. Okay, we're at the end of chapter 34. 35 through 40 literally is almost word for word the same thing we went over before. So that's why we're not going to do it. We're going to spend some time talking about what we want to do next and getting ready for that. Um, but the story that went before, Moses asked to see the glory of God. And God says, "Nobody can see my glory and live." Okay, so the glory is not his face, because we find in other places in Scripture that God talks face to face with Abraham. He appears with the angels before he goes to Sodom and takes care of business. He talks to Abraham. Twice we discover that he enters the not the Holy of Holies, the tent of meeting, and it describes God and Moses as talking to each other face to face. Have a fellowship meal. That's right. That was up the mountain, and that was draped within his glory. So um, there is there's a limiting that God allows himself so that he can stand before. So what Moses is asking for is something more than he has received already, something more than Abraham even received. He's asking for a full revelation of God's glory. And God says, "No way." That's right. And he's already kind of made that clear. No one else is to come up to the mountain. So only Moses was able to experience what was going on within the cloud of the great. It was described as fire, it's described as lightning. And God does something so that Moses is able to experience that, but everyone else is to stay away. They can visually see, but they can't experience the withinness of it, which is kind of a weird way to think about that. So God does something special for Moses, or really special for us too. He has to see the glory of God. And he says, no, you can't do that. No human being can do that and live. But I'm going to place you in a crack in this rock. I'm going to walk by. I'm going to shield your face with my hand, and you'll be able to see my back. But he describes that as his goodness. So we take from that what we are able to experience of God in its fullness is his goodness. We can't experience the overwhelming glory that is of God, but we can experience his goodness. So that's what Moses was able to experience. And then he does that, and then later he goes, after this whole episode is over. We mentioned this before, I believe. Well, we've always imagined that to be the mountaintop experience, right? But it's not. Then God tells him, cut the stones and come up the mountain. So this is something that happens geographically, locationally, with locality, I should say, down away from the top of the mountain. But God provides this mountaintop experience so that Moses can receive the law again. Okay. He says, carve tablets to replace the ones that you broke and bring them up with you. And God writes again what he wants on those tablets. And then we get to this place in verse 29. So Moses experienced something that is quite remarkable. And the reason and how we know that this was more than what had been received before, but less than what Moses had asked for, is that he didn't die, but his countenance, or his what you are able to see of him, has changed. So as Moses descended from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, as he descended the mountain, he did not realize that the skin of his face shone as a result of his speaking with the Lord. So Moses is glowing. Yeah.
I mean, not glory, but goodness.
The goodness. Okay. So he's shining. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face shone. They were afraid to come near to him. Okay. But Moses called out to them, so Aaron and all the leaders of the community returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. So evidently from a ways, a distance, they could see something is really different about Moses, and it's scaring us. So they retreat, and Moses has to call them back. They come and they return to him, and Moses spoke to them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near, and he commanded them to do everything the Lord had told him on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. So he tells them this with the authority, really, of shining, much like the glory of God may have been experienced from them viewing it from away and looking at the mountain. So a little piece of God's glory that they could observe had kind of been placed on Moses. And they had already been told, if you approach this, you're going to die. And here it is approaching them, in the face of Moses. And so Moses puts a veil over his face. For what reason? It's so that, he doesn't want them to be fearful of him. But he would do that, and we see that it would fade. And when he went back into the tent of meeting to meet with God, he would remove the veil. So we'll look at that for a minute. Afterwards, all the Israelites came. He told them everything that God had told him on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking, he put a veil over his face. But whenever Moses went before the Lord to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. After he came out, he would tell the Israelites what he had been commanded, and the Israelites would see that Moses' face was radiant, then Moses would put the veil over his face again until he went to speak to the Lord. So we know this passage. Paul gives us a commentary on this passage, that when Moses sees the glory of God, that it fades, and he would put a veil over his face so they could not see that it would fade. Okay, so he had to get another dose of it for people to see it on him. And of course, what Paul is describing is that we don't have to do that. That we carry the glory of God as Moses did. We carry that same glory, that same reflection of the glory of God in us all the time because of Christ Jesus. We are his glory, is the way that Paul describes that in not one, maybe three different passages in Scripture. And so we have a better countenance than Moses did, because it doesn't have to be renewed. It's all the time. Now, if we put veils over our faces to hide that, that's our problem, and we should never do that. We should always allow that light to shine. Okay, so important, now that we get to chapter 35, he does one more lesson on the Sabbath in Exodus. So this is about how many? 5, 6 times? Lots of times. So the Sabbath remains a keystone portion of the way that God wants his people to live before him. And it's worded in a little bit differently. In verse 2, it says, 6 days work is to be done, but on the seventh day you're to have a holy day, a Sabbath of complete rest to the Lord. So the rest, the quitting, Sabbath means to quit or to rest. The rest is for us, but it is to be to God. So we experience it, but we experience it in a way that allows us to relate to God. He wants that Sabbath period of time to be meaningful to the relationship that we have with him. So we experience the rest, but it is a rest to the Lord. It is a thing that we offer to him as a means of experiencing life together with him. Then he says, anyone who does work on it, it must be executed. So he's serious about it. Okay? Do not light a fire in any of your homes on the Sabbath day. So what does he say? This is where the tradition laws come in. So when God says this to Moses, don't light a fire, it's considered what? Work. So all sorts of things that were that might be considered work. I mean, anything more than lighting a fire would be work. So walking to your neighbor's house, if it was so far, don't do it. It might, God might see it as work and he would strike you dead. He would execute you for it, or any number of things like that to maintain the Sabbath. Okay. I get questions in the jail all the time that why don't we keep the Sabbath? Why don't we keep the seventh day, which would be on our calendar the Saturday? Why don't we keep a Sabbath day like that? And of course, when Gentile believers became Christians, and when Jewish believers would they would honor the Sabbath as a part of their Jewish heritage, but then they would also honor the first day of the week as the day that they worshiped. So they rested completely on the Sabbath, but then when the first day of the week would roll around, that was the time when they would worship. That was their day of worship. The Sabbath was no longer a part of that for them. Gentiles never honored the Sabbath, and nor were they asked to, because they had been freed from the law. On Sunday nights, we've talked about that with the Jerusalem Council. Paul begged them not to place these burdens upon them because they couldn't even keep them themselves. Peter agreed. And so they weren't asked to keep a Sabbath. All they were asked to do was to abstain from sexual immorality, to not eat blood, to avoid what was strangled. Yeah, and to stay away from idols. So 4 things, didn't include the Sabbath. Um, and so that's the main reason why that we don't keep a Sabbath in the Christian church, is because it was kind of set free from that. Although a Sabbath is a good thing, to have a day that you just don't do anything. And my wife doesn't understand that. She doesn't understand Sabbath at all. She thinks it's Sunday and I work on Sunday. I need another day of the week where I just don't do anything, and I try to use that time to study and prepare, and that's not work to me. So um, anyway, everybody should have that because of the reasons why God states over and over again. It's that time that we need with Him, and He doesn't ask for your whole days every other day. You know, prayers in the morning, prayers at night. That comes out of a Jewish tradition. Um, Paul said he prayed continually. We could carry that, but God doesn't ask for us to day after day just sit. And this was what some of the mystics did in the early part of the church, um, during the 6th, 7th, 8th century, maybe even before. Um, some of the mystics thought you devoted your whole every waking hour to God, and so you would. Some of them would build platforms on top of poles, and they would climb up those poles and they would sit there and meditate and pray and do whatever for years. And they had attendants at the bottom to give them food up and to carry their waist down. I mean, this was how they thought God intended for people to live. There's monasteries in Europe where people would nearly wall themselves into a room for prayer. They would spend their whole days praying. They had high windows where light could come through, and they had a small little crawl space that they could crawl from the room into the cathedral, or where they held worship. And when it was worship time, they would crawl through there to get there to do their worship. But then they would crawl back into this little room and pray, because that was really what they thought God had called them to do in some sort of way. So everything can be carried to an extreme where we do too much, and then some not at all. And God's just asking for the one day. Just give me the one day that I rested. You can rest, and we can spend some time together. Uh, Hard to do in our culture, but it can be done if we decide to do it. Okay, so the rest of this is all um, the same thing that we did before. So I'm going to scroll down here to the end of chapter 40. Um, that's too far. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So we have this, um, describes all the things that are being made to put in the tabernacle. Okay. And then we have it again. And then squeezed in the middle is this episode with Moses, and the glory that Moses asks for and what he receives. And then the result of that with his face. So we have God's glory represented in these various utensils and things that are being made, and the way that the gold is laid over everything. Even how the poles are made for the tent, they have gold in certain places. All of that is meant to represent the glory of God. So they couldn't see directly the glory of God, but they could experience a replica of that as best as could be made in the tabernacle. And then squeezed in between is Moses' request, I want to see the glory of God. And we're assured again, you can't, but you can experience my goodness. And so what happens in the tabernacle here on out is worship, and worship of God, and what they receive from God is his goodness. they are able to approach him in a limited way, not in the full way of his glory. So it is in a limited way, but it is the way that God desires and designs so that we are not separated from him. We can be near to him. And the way that we can understand what that is that we're experiencing the goodness of God. And so when Christ comes, we again experience the goodness of God. But we experience it in a way that we can approach it fully because he's not only the Son of God, he's the Son of Man. He's fully human and fully God. And so everything about the glory of God and the nature of what it means in his goodness comes together in Christ Jesus. And we ultimately experience that goodness as an expression of his love for us on the cross. So he comes and he takes the place of our sin, the penalty of our sin, but he does it not out of obligation, but out of love. And so we very quickly are able to make the connection. Well, the goodness of God is the love of God, and the love of God we know perfectly in his Son and all that he has done, so that we may believe in him and then enter into God's goodness completely. So that's what he says when he's the night that he's betrayed. I'm leaving here, but I'm preparing a place for you to come to so that you're going to be with me and the Father. Something that had not even been imagined before, because how could someone go into the glory of God? Okay. But he says, I'm going to make that possible for you. This is what this is. So the glory of God is an important part of our experience, our Christian experience. It's not just that we're saved when we die, and it's not just that because we live with him today that our lives have meaning beyond our own. They have meaning in the grand economy that God has working to bring salvation to the world. It also means that we're going with Christ to enter into the glory of God. So one way that the writer of Hebrews describes that is that we enter into the throne room of grace. So grace, goodness, glory, love, all these things come together, maybe not linearly in the New Testament or even in the Old Testament, but they come together globally. They all connect like not even more than spokes on a wheel. They're all enmeshed together and create a dynamic whole. And that's the life we get to live. So the last part, verse 34 says, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So all of this is finished, everything's done, and God settles into the place where not only is he going to meet Moses, this is where he meets the priest and the people through the activity of the priest. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Okay, so Moses had gone into the tent of meeting before and met God in the cloud, but now it says he couldn't go in because of the cloud, but also because the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So what's different here is that God has settled into the tabernacle. Okay, the tent is caught up in the cloud, but the presence of God is in the tabernacle. Moses doesn't go in the tabernacle. Who goes? Aaron goes, and his sons go. The Israelites set out whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle throughout all the stages of their journey. If the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and there was a fire inside the cloud by night, visible to the entire house of Israel throughout all the stages of their journey. And Exodus just comes to an end like that. You got to really have to read Leviticus and Deuteronomy to appreciate the rest of it, which we're not even going to do this time. So, did I kind of make myself clear about the whole glory thing and how that is important to us? So when you read about our life as Christians and you come across that word glory, you really need to take some time and determine how all of that fits in to everything else that is available to us. Because we're not glorious. Moses wasn't glorious. His face faded. But we possess the glory of God through our faith in Jesus. He shares it in a way, and it's not visibly, you know. None of us shine like the sun and that sort of thing. So how are we an expression of God's glory? Like Jesus every day. When we're more like Jesus, his who he is God's glory. Um, Let me see if I can find what I'm looking for here. It's easy for me to find it here than find it. Uh, well, John 17 is a good place. Father, the hour has come to glorify your Son, so the Son may glorify you. When John uses the hour, he's talking about Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay, so this is going to be the glory of God present with Jesus, and the glory that the Son and this is the way that the Son glorifies the Father. You give me authority over all people. Let's see. Verse 4, I have glorified you on earth by completing the work you gave me to do. Now, Father, glorify me in your presence with that glory I had with you before. So what is Jesus says, I'm glorifying you twice. I glorified you how? Through the work you gave me to do. Okay? Earlier in John chapter 6, he says that the only thing you got to worry about is doing the work that I've given you to do. Okay? The work that we have is to believe in him. The work that he has is that he does this work to bring glory to the Father. So the work that we do also brings glory. Um, Let me see. Let's see. Everything I have is yours, and everything you have is mine, and I am glorified in them. I'm no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I'm coming to you. Holy Father, protect them. Let's see. I'm looking for. I'm still not there. Uh, I have given them the glory you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. All right. So we receive glory from Christ. And how do we receive that? From him. As he is glorious, we are glorious. As he and the Father are one, so are we are one with him. So I'm doing this to make a point that we're not made glorious. We share in the glory that Christ gives us, and that glory is the same glory that he shares with the Father. So all through that prayer and in other ways, we are connected to God, not only through the life that we have in us through Jesus, but the glory that we share. So glory becomes an important thing for us believers, and we have to understand what that means. We can be glorious or we can be inglorious. Okay? And God has provided the life of his Son so that we may receive his glory. So the only way that a believer shields the world from the glory of God that is in us is to shroud it. And we do that in various ways, right? We we sin without confession. We live our lives in ways where people can't see the glory of God. They see the glory of man, which later in Romans we discover is a terrible thing, and in Corinthians. So we'll continue to run across this word and we kind of read by it sometime because we think of it as something visual, but it's not that. It's who we are, and it's important to God that we live in that glory. All right, so that's it. We're done with Exodus. Uh, well, is that what y'all would like to do? Um, yeah, I did. Oh my goodness, my old pastor called me. He must not realize it's Wednesday night. He's 95 years old. I'll have to I'll have to call him here in a minute. Uh, yeah, we can do the Corinthian letters. They're good. Uh, I thought about doing the prison epistles, but they are repetitive. So they're kind of difficult to do in a study together without, I mean, to do them, we could piecemeal from all of them, but I don't really want to do that. Have y'all enjoyed doing this kind of verse by verse and taking it? Okay. There's other ways to do this, but I kind of like it because almost in every book we have favorite passages and we tend to read by the other ones. That's why I was loving the prophet so much, but that gets a little heavy, son. Book after book after book. That wasn't a good idea, I have to admit. Um, and or we could do either John or we could do a synoptic study of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's pretty easy to do because we have parallel uh, gospels that we can use in our study that just so that we could do a parallel study. Yeah, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke they put together, and you can see where. So I got one of those I can put on the screen. We could do that. Um, I'm really open to anything you want. Dude. Okay. Uh, okay. Well, I'm going to think about it, but I really, now that I've mentioned the synoptics, that might be a that might be a fun thing to do. And most people don't ever study them that way, so that would be different. Uh, and then even in John, there's some we can kind of bleed over into John some when we find those passages. And then there's also a book that I have that um, it synchronizes teachings of Paul with the Gospels. So maybe I can bring some of that into and see where, there's always, especially scholars, there's always this battle between how does the letters of Paul relate back to the Gospels? Is it always does it always do it, and is it always fidelitous to the Gospels and that sort of thing? And people nitpick things apart, but there's a lot. I mean, this book is this thick that parallels Paul's teachings to the Gospels. So we'll do some of that. If we try to do all of them, we'll get bogged down again. But we can do some of that. Uh, okay. Yeah. I'm sorry I don't have more tonight, but I was I sat down and looked at it earlier in the week and I said, "Oh no, we can't do this again. We just did this like 2 weeks ago, so I didn't want to do that." Uh, I would encourage you to go ahead and read Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy now that we've gone this far. Leviticus gets into great detail as to the worship that was conducted and the reasons why. Um, Deuteronomy has some more narrative about events that happen that, yeah, we don't even touch in this. Um, there's an expansion of the law that talks more about some exceptions, some more detail that happens. Um, So all of that's good. It's just that Exodus doesn't get into any of it, really. I mean, it's more about the Exodus. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, so what for you?
yeah, yeah. All important. Right. Bye. Hope you enjoyed that little short little lesson.
Cool.